Hi, my name is Amanda Collins. I'm 28 years old, and this is my story. Most people think that when someone says they were an accident, it's just a figure of speech. But in my case, it wasn't. My father actually told me, to my face, more than once, that I was a mistake, something that shouldn't have happened. I carried those words like an invisible scar. You can't see it, but it burns, and it changes you. What he didn't know was that the very person he called a mistake would become the only reason he was able to keep a roof over his head. And when the truth came out, well, let's just say he wasn't ready for the consequences. I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida. My mom, Judith, was a nurse, strong, quiet, and endlessly patient. My dad, Richard Collins, worked in construction when he felt like it. Most of the time, though, he preferred sitting in front of the TV with a beer in his hand, yelling at the screen or at us. He was never physically abusive, but words were his weapon, and he knew how to cut deep. Growing up, I learned early not to expect much from him. He barely showed up to school events. He never said he was proud of me. When I turned 8, I remember asking him if he loved me. He scoffed, took a long sip from his beer, and said, "You were a mistake. You weren't supposed to happen." I think something died inside me that day. I spent most of my childhood trying to make up for that mistake. I studied hard, got good grades, stayed out of trouble. My mom tried her best to protect me from the worst of him, but she was tired, always tired, and she aged faster than she should have. Sometimes I wondered if loving him had slowly drained the life out of her. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to hear how I turned a lifetime of rejection into a story of redemption and strength. When I turned 18, I left home. I didn't have money for college right away, so I worked 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night. I lived in a tiny studio apartment that smelled like mildew, but I didn't care. It was mine. It was quiet, and no one there called me a mistake. Eventually, I managed to enroll in community college and took night classes in business. It took me 7 years, but I graduated. Then I landed a job at a mid-size real estate firm downtown. I worked my way up from receptionist to account manager in less than 3 years. I wasn't rich, but I was stable, independent. Everything my father told me I'd never be. And then the call came. My mom had passed away. A stroke. Sudden. No warning. It broke me. I hadn't visited in almost a year. I always had a reason. Work, deadlines, the pain of going back to that house. But suddenly she was gone, and I hadn't even said goodbye. At the funeral, my father didn't cry. He sat stone-faced in the front row like he was watching a game. After the service, he pulled me aside and said, "Guess it's just you and me now." The bitterness in his voice made it clear. He wasn't looking for connection. He was looking for someone to fill the void Mom left. I didn't move back in, but I started checking in on him. He was a mess. Bills unpaid, refrigerator empty, house falling apart. The man was living in chaos and pretending everything was fine. I couldn't watch him crumble, even if he never lifted a finger for me. So I started helping, quietly. I paid the utility bills. I stocked the fridge. I sent anonymous money orders to cover his mortgage. I told myself it was what Mom would have wanted. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for her memory. He never asked where the help came from. He assumed the government was bailing him out, or that the bank had made a mistake. Typical. Meanwhile, I was drowning in the silence. At work, I smiled. I performed. But inside, I was spiraling. No one knew that I was holding up the life of the man who never wanted me. The final straw came on my 27th birthday. I had invited a few friends over for dinner. We were laughing, having wine, celebrating. Then my phone rang. It was him. I stepped outside to answer. His voice was slurred. "You think you're so special, don't you? Fancy little job, fancy apartment. You think you're better than me." I said, "Dad, it's my birthday. Can we not do this right now?" He barked out a bitter laugh. "Birthday? Yeah. Another year I gotta pretend you weren't the worst thing that ever happened to me." I hung up. That night I cried harder than I had in years. But something inside me shifted. Not sadness, not anger, clarity. I realized I wasn't a mistake. I was a miracle. I had survived him. I had risen in spite of him, and I was done apologizing for existing. That's when I made a decision. If he wanted to keep taking from me, he'd have to know exactly who was paying his bills. No more anonymous help, no more hiding. He was about to find out just how much of a mistake I really was. And that was the beginning of everything that followed. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a headache that felt like it reached down into my soul. But unlike all the other mornings after he hurt me with his words, this time I wasn't going to let it pass. I wasn't going to forgive and forget. I wasn't going to let him haunt my life from a distance while I kept him afloat in secret. I was done being his invisible lifeline. I got dressed, grabbed a folder I had been keeping for months, filled with receipts, mortgage records, and proof of every anonymous payment I'd made, and drove straight to his house. The drive from my apartment in Lake Eola to his rundown bungalow on the west side of Orlando felt longer than it was. The whole time I was rehearsing what I would say, but when I pulled up in front of his house, I wasn't sure anymore if I should even bother. The front yard looked worse than ever. Overgrown grass, 2 trash cans knocked over, and the screen door hanging by one hinge. But the car was there. He was home. I stepped out of the car with my heels clicking confidently on the pavement, even though my hands were shaking. When he opened the door, he looked surprised to see me. "Amanda?" he asked, squinting. It was barely noon and he already looked like he'd been drinking. "You didn't call?" "I didn't come here to talk," I said, pushing past him and entering the living room. It still smelled like stale beer and mildew. Nothing had changed. He closed the door behind me, grumbling something I didn't catch. "What's this about?" he said, sitting heavily in his recliner. I stood in front of him and handed him the folder. "Open it." He looked at it like it was poisoned. "What is this? Your college transcripts or something?" "Just open it." He did, and page by page, I watched the confusion grow on his face as the pieces clicked together. The mortgage receipts, the electric bill confirmations, the grocery delivery invoices, all in his name, all paid by me. "Wait, all of this was you?" His voice cracked, and for a second he actually looked lost. I crossed my arms. "Yeah, every month, for almost a year. Because otherwise, you'd have lost this house." He stared at the papers in silence, then looked up at me. "Why?" I laughed, sharp and bitter. "Why? Because Mom would have wanted me to. Because I couldn't stand the thought of you sleeping on the street. Because even after everything you ever said to me, I still had some sick part of me that wanted to believe you could be saved." He dropped the folder onto the floor. "So what? Now you want to meddle?" "No, I don't want anything from you, except the truth. I want to hear you say it." "Say what?" "Say I'm not a mistake." He looked away. "You always were too dramatic." My heart sank, but I wasn't surprised. I nodded slowly and walked toward the door. "Fine, then you can figure out how to pay for next month's mortgage on your own." That made him flinch. "Wait, what do you mean?" "I mean, I'm done. No more money, no more support. You can sink or swim. It's not my responsibility anymore." I opened the door and walked out before he could say another word. That week, something shifted in me. I went to work like usual, but my focus sharpened. I had been pouring so much energy into keeping someone else's life from falling apart that I hadn't realized how much of mine was standing still. I started staying later at the office, offering to help with projects no one else wanted to take. My boss noticed. She called me in and said she was impressed with my drive and dedication. A promotion was coming. Maybe not right away, but soon. I felt alive again. But Richard didn't go quietly. 3 days after I left that folder, he showed up at my apartment. Unannounced. Loud. Drunk. He banged on my door like the world was ending. I opened it, only because I didn't want to disturb my neighbors. "You embarrassed me," he slurred. "You come into my house and wave your money around like I'm some kind of bum." I didn't answer. "You think you're better than me?" I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. "I am better than you. Not because of money. Because I would never treat my child the way you treated me." He stumbled back, caught off guard by the venom in my voice. "You're a cold-hearted little—" "Don't," I snapped. "Don't finish that sentence unless you want me to call the cops. Go home, Dad. You still have one. For now." He left, but that was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I started getting strange phone calls, blocked numbers, silence on the other end. Once, someone breathed into the receiver and whispered, "Ungrateful." My tires were slashed twice. I couldn't prove it was him, but I knew. And then came the worst moment of all. At work, during a Monday morning meeting, my boss called me into her office. She looked uncomfortable. "Amanda, someone's been calling the company anonymously, claiming you've been embezzling funds." My stomach dropped. "What?" "We don't believe it, but we had to investigate. Your name is clear, but it's disturbing." I nodded, too stunned to speak. That night I sat on my couch shaking. He wasn't just trying to guilt me anymore. He was trying to destroy me. So I made another decision. I went to a lawyer. I laid everything out. Every dollar I paid, every message, every threat, even the voicemail recordings I had started collecting. I wasn't looking to sue him. I wanted protection. I wanted a restraining order. I wanted to draw a line that he could never cross again. The lawyer was sympathetic. He said I had more than enough evidence. The paperwork began, but I didn't stop there. I called the mortgage company and explained that I would no longer be making payments. I had no legal obligation to the property. If the house went into default, so be it. That was his consequence to face. And finally, I blocked his number, emails, social media, every avenue of access. But revenge, I learned, isn't always about shouting back. Sometimes it's about walking away so completely that the other person is left alone with their echo. Still, something told me it wasn't over. Not yet. The man who called me a mistake wasn't going to let go that easily. Hi again. If you've made it this far, then maybe you understand that this wasn't just about a daughter trying to make peace with her past. It was about reclaiming something that was stolen before I even understood the value of it. My voice, my dignity, my right to exist without shame. But here's the thing about walking away from someone like my father. Sometimes, when you finally find your strength, they panic. Because if they can't control you anymore, they try to destroy what you've built. And in my case, that was about to get dangerously real. About 3 weeks after I filed the restraining order, I received a letter in the mail. It was an eviction notice. But it wasn't for me, it was for him. I hadn't been involved in his mortgage since I stopped making payments, but I guess it took the bank some time to catch up. The letter had been mailed to my address because, for some stupid reason, years ago, I had once helped him set up automatic notifications using my email and phone number. A part of me wanted to throw it out, pretend I hadn't seen it. But another part, the part of me that had survived years of his emotional warfare, knew this was the moment things would shift permanently. I didn't tell him. I waited. I watched. I knew exactly when the foreclosure notice would go up on the front lawn because I'd driven by the house every day on my way to work, never stopping, never looking too long, just enough to keep track. When the sign finally appeared, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just silence. That silence broke 2 nights later. I was home, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and a book, when someone started pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding. I didn't even need to look through the peephole. I knew. It was him. "Amanda." His voice was hoarse, panicked. "Amanda, open this damn door." I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen. "I know you had something to do with this. Don't act like you didn't." There was a pause, then a thud. He was sitting against the door. And then, he started to cry. Not the manipulative kind of crying he used to use to make Mom feel guilty. Real sobs. The kind that scrape their way out of a person like they're being ripped open from the inside. I wanted to open the door. God, some part of me really did. But I didn't. Because I knew better. I'd been pulled back in too many times before. So I sat in the quiet, while on the other side of the door, the man who once told me I was a mistake, now cried for help. Eventually, he left. And then came the twist I didn't expect. The next morning, I got a call from the local hospital. Richard Collins had been admitted during the night. Dehydration, minor injuries. Nothing fatal. Apparently, after leaving my place, he wandered the streets until someone called an ambulance. The nurse said they found a list of emergency contacts in his wallet. My name was the only one listed. Of course it was. I sat in my car outside the hospital for almost 30 minutes before deciding to go in. Not because I wanted to see him, but because I needed to know for myself that I was truly done. That I could look him in the eyes and feel nothing. When I entered his room, he was asleep, His face looked different somehow, less cruel, more fragile. He looked like someone who had finally run out of battles to fight. I stood there, quietly, just watching, and for the first time in my life, I realized something deeply sad and strangely liberating. I didn't hate him. I didn't love him either. He was just a man, broken, bitter, drowning in the consequences of a life he'd never taken responsibility for. He opened his eyes and saw me. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but I beat him to it. "I'm not here to save you, Dad," I said softly. "I just came to see it with my own eyes. That it's over." His eyes filled with tears. Not the performative kind this time, the real kind. "Amanda," he whispered, "I have nothing left." I nodded. "You had everything once. A wife who loved you, a daughter who begged for your approval, and you threw it away." He tried to sit up, but winced. "I didn't know how to be a father." I shrugged. "That's not my burden to carry." We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said something I wasn't prepared for. "You were never a mistake." The words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't believe him. Not fully. But hearing them, it mattered. More than I wanted to admit. Still, I stood up. "You said that too late." And I walked out. I didn't visit him again, but the story didn't end there. A few days later, I received a voicemail from a woman named Cheryl. She introduced herself as Richard's half-sister, someone I'd never met or even heard of. She said she lived up in Georgia and had just found out he was sick. Apparently, she'd been estranged from the family for years, but decided to call and check on him. "He talked about you, you know," she said on the message. "Said he messed up with you more than anyone else. Said you were the only person who ever really tried to love him." I didn't know how to feel about that. A week later, I got another call, this time from a lawyer. Richard had passed away, just like that. Gone. Liver failure. The years of alcohol had caught up to him. The hospital released his body to a funeral home that contacted me because I was the only next of kin. I handled the arrangements. Simple and quiet. No service. No speeches. No mourners. Just ashes. And a death certificate. When the lawyer handed me the will, I almost laughed. He'd left the house to me. The same house I had paid to save for nearly a year. The same house that had been foreclosed and auctioned off weeks earlier. Symbolic, I suppose. But there was something else. In a handwritten note tucked at the back of the will, he'd written, "You were never a mistake. I was. I'm sorry." And for the first time since I was a little girl, I cried over my father. Not because I missed him, but because that tiny, starving part of me that had waited 28 years for that apology finally got it. And it wasn't enough, but it was something. After I left the lawyer's office with the will in one hand and that note in the other, I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, just staring out at the city. Orlando had always been a complicated place for me. It was the backdrop of all my worst memories, but also the soil where I'd planted myself and grown. Slowly, stubbornly, like a weed in the cracks of broken concrete. The skyline had changed since I was a kid. New buildings, new restaurants, new promises of luxury and hope. But some streets still looked the same, especially the ones that led back to the old neighborhood where I grew up. I found myself driving there without thinking, past the gas station where my dad used to buy beer, past the elementary school where I learned to read, past the tiny park where my mom once pushed me on the swings. The house was no longer his. The bank had reclaimed it weeks ago and sold it to a private investor who probably planned to flip it. The lawn had been cut, the trash cans replaced. The front porch had a fresh coat of paint, and for a second, it didn't look like the place where so much pain had been stored. It looked like any other home. That hurt more than I expected. I parked across the street and just watched it for a while. I knew I didn't belong there anymore. I wasn't that girl. I wasn't the daughter desperate for approval, or the woman trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. I was something else now. I was free, but freedom is strange. It's quiet. It doesn't throw a party when it arrives. It just waits for you to notice that the weight you've been carrying is gone, that you can breathe without apologizing for it. Over the next few weeks, I did a lot of breathing. I took time off work. Not because I was grieving in the traditional sense, but because I needed space to recalibrate, to figure out who I was without the shadow of Richard Collins hovering behind me. I went on long walks around Lake Eola. I sat by the water and wrote in a journal I hadn't touched in years. I started therapy again. Not because I was broken, but because I finally had the strength to unpack everything I'd shoved into the darkest parts of myself. And slowly, I began to reclaim my life. My apartment, once a quiet sanctuary, became a space of transformation. I donated old clothes, rearranged furniture, painted the walls. I invited friends over more often. I laughed more. I slept better. I started cooking again, not just microwaving frozen dinners while answering work emails. Real meals. Dishes that smelled like comfort and possibility. One morning, I got a call from my boss. "Amanda," she said, "I know you're still on leave, but there's an opportunity I want to offer you. Regional Account Director. It's yours if you want it." I almost dropped the phone. It was the position I'd dreamed of for years, but never dared to believe I could reach. Not because I wasn't qualified, but because somewhere deep inside, a voice still whispered, "You don't deserve good things." But that voice, it wasn't mine. It was his. So I silenced it. I accepted the job. With the promotion came new responsibilities, new challenges, and a significant pay increase. And with that financial freedom came a question I hadn't asked myself in a long time. What do I want? Not what do I need to survive? Not what do I owe? But what do I, Amanda Collins, genuinely want? The answer surprised me. I wanted peace. I wanted beauty. I wanted to build something that had nothing to do with where I came from and everything to do with who I was becoming. So I started looking for houses. Not to escape my past, but to step fully into my future. Somewhere quiet, with light. Somewhere I could plant roots. Not the kind that chain you down, but the kind that hold you steady. After weeks of searching, I found it. A small 2-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of Orlando. White siding, blue shutters, a little porch where I could drink coffee in the mornings. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't big, but it felt right. I closed on the house 6 months after my father's death. The day I got the keys, I walked through every empty room and whispered, "You made it." Not to anyone else, just to me. To the little girl who once hid in her bedroom to avoid cruel words. To the teenager who left home with nothing but a duffel bag and a dream. To the woman who paid her father's mortgage while he called her worthless. We made it. And with that came something I hadn't expected. Forgiveness. Not for him, but for me. I forgave myself for waiting so long to walk away. I forgave myself for the years I tried to be enough for someone who couldn't see my value. I forgave myself for carrying guilt that was never mine to begin with. One evening, a few weeks after I moved in, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name, handwritten. Inside was a photograph. It was old, faded, bent at the corners. It was of me and my mom, sitting on the front steps of our old house. I couldn't have been older than 7. I was smiling. She was holding my hand. Behind us, out of focus but unmistakable, stood my father. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking down, beer in hand, face hard. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "You were never invisible." See, I knew who it was from. Cheryl. I never called her back. Maybe one day I will. But for now, that picture sits framed on the bookshelf in my living room. A reminder of what was, of what never had to be, of what I refuse to carry forward. My story isn't about revenge in the way most people imagine. There was no courtroom showdown, no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match that ended in tears and resolution. My revenge was quieter. It was in the choice to stop bleeding for someone who never once tried to heal. It was in the decision to thrive where I was told I'd wither. It was in every step I took away from the fire, and every brick I laid building a home of my own. Some nights, I still dream of him. Not in nightmares, just memories. And sometimes I wake up crying, not because I miss him, but because grief is complicated and closure isn't always clean. But when the tears pass, I go to the window, look out at the trees, the porch, the soft light glowing in my quiet little street, and I whisper to myself, "You are not a mistake. You are the proof that even broken roots can grow something beautiful." A few months after settling into my new house, I started sleeping through the night again. That might sound trivial, but for me it was monumental. For years, sleep had been a battleground. I'd lie awake with my thoughts spinning, my chest tight, my body frozen under the weight of memories I couldn't quite shake. But now, things were different. My bed felt like a sanctuary instead of a trap. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was restful, healing. But just when I began to believe I had closed the chapter for good, something unexpected happened that pulled everything to the surface again. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember because I had a coffee stain on my favorite blouse and was already running late for work. When I opened the front door, there was a package sitting on my porch. No label, no postage, just a small brown box with my name scribbled across the top in black ink. I froze. For a long time, I just stared at it. Something in me knew. It wasn't from a friend. It wasn't from work. It wasn't anything ordinary. Carefully, I picked it up and brought it inside. I set it down on the kitchen counter and opened it. Inside was a stack of old cassette tapes. Actual tapes, the kind you'd need a player for. Beneath them, a yellowed envelope. I opened it and read the note. "These belong to your mother. I thought you should have them. See?" At first I didn't understand. Then I saw what was written on the labels. Judy, April 1998. Judy, August 1999. Dozens of dates. My mother's name. My chest tightened. My hands trembled. I didn't know she kept journals. And I certainly didn't know she recorded them. That night, I drove to an antique electronics store in Winter Park and bought a dusty old cassette player that still worked. I took it home, plugged it in, and sat on the floor like a kid about to open a time capsule. I inserted the first tape. Her voice filled the room like a ghost. "Hi, it's me again. I don't know why I'm doing this. Maybe just to feel like I still exist." I broke instantly. Tears poured down my face as I listened to her speak. She talked about her day, about me, about how tired she was, how scared, how hopeful. And then she talked about him, about Richard, how he had changed, how he had grown cold, how he had begun calling me names even when I was just a baby. She said she stayed because she didn't know where else to go, because she thought maybe she could shield me from the worst of it. "Amanda is so smart," she said in one recording. "She asks questions no one her age should be asking, and she hugs me like she knows I need it. I don't know how she already understands that I'm not okay, but she does. She always does." Each night after work, I listened to another tape, one by one. Her voice became a part of my home, my healing. Some nights I laughed at her jokes, surprised by how much of her sense of humor I'd inherited. Other nights I sobbed, curled into myself, feeling the weight of her pain and love woven into every word. But then came the tape that changed everything. It was dated just a few weeks before she died. "I've made arrangements," she said, her voice clear, steady. "If anything happens to me, I want Amanda to find this box. I've told Cheryl where it is. I don't trust Richard. I know he's been hiding things from Amanda. I know he's been using her. She doesn't see it yet, but she will. And when she does, I need her to remember who she is. She's not a mistake. She's a miracle. She saved me more times than I can count. And one day she's going to save herself." I collapsed. I had to pause the tape. I couldn't breathe. All this time, I thought I had been alone. I thought I had carried the weight of my father's cruelty in silence. But my mother had seen it. She had known. She had believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And somehow, even in death, she was still showing up for me. It was then that I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him win, not just in life, but in legacy. I pulled out a folder from my filing cabinet, the same one I had once used to document all the bills I paid for him, and started a new file. This time, it was for me, for my future, for everything I still needed to say, not just to him, but to the world. I decided to write, not a journal, not a letter, a book. I called it Not a Mistake. It started as a memoir, raw, unfiltered, full of pain and truth, but it quickly became something more. A love letter to my mother, a blueprint for others like me, who had been raised in the shadows of broken fathers and still found the strength to bloom. I wrote every night after work, sometimes until 2 or 3 a.m. Words poured out of me like they'd been waiting for years to be set free. And then, something incredible happened. A small publishing house picked it up. They believed in the story, in me, and before I knew it, I was being interviewed, invited to speak at women's shelters, asked to share my journey with people who had stories of their own. Different details, same scars. But here's the real climax. One night, after a book signing in Tampa, a woman approached me. She was in her early 50s, eyes full of grief and fire. She said, "I read your book. I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 6 years. I didn't think she'd ever forgive me, but I called her after I read your story." And she answered. I hugged her. Tight. We didn't say anything else. We didn't have to. In that moment, I understood something that made every painful step of my story worth it. My revenge wasn't about punishing my father. It was about healing the line that came after him. It was about stopping the cycle. I couldn't fix the past, but I could shape the future. And I was finally doing that. Not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been told she was unwanted. Because we are not mistakes. We are the ones who carry light into the darkness. We are the ones who rise. When people ask me now what forgiveness feels like, I never give them a straight answer. Because forgiveness is not a moment. It's not a decision you make and check off like a box. It's a slow unraveling, a peeling back of years, a rewiring of the heart. Sometimes it feels like freedom. Other times it feels like grief. But for me, the first real glimpse of forgiveness came not through letting go of my father, but through learning how to hold space for myself, for my truth, for my strength, for the woman I had become without even realizing it. After my book was published, everything around me seemed to shift. My days were still ordinary in many ways. I still made my own coffee every morning, still drove to the same office, still listened to the same playlists on my commute. But something deep within me had changed. I felt grounded in a way I never had before, like my feet had finally found real earth to stand on. I no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. I no longer minimized my feelings to keep the peace. And most importantly, I no longer carried the shame that had once been handed to me by someone too broken to love properly. And as I embraced this new chapter, the world began to open in ways I couldn't have predicted. 6 months after the release of Not a Mistake, I was invited to speak at a national conference for mental health and trauma recovery. I stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people, holding a microphone in hands that had once trembled just picking up the phone to call my father. I told them about growing up in a house where silence was safer than speaking. I told them about the night I stopped paying his mortgage, about the tapes, about the apology that came too late. And when I finished, the room stood up for me. They clapped, they cried, they saw me. It was overwhelming, but it was also healing. After the conference, I received dozens of messages from strangers, men and women, who had carried similar wounds. They said they saw themselves in my story, that my words had given them permission to confront their own pain. Some wrote that they had never told anyone about the things they endured as children, but after reading my book, they finally had the courage to speak. That was when it hit me. My story wasn't just about pain or survival. It was about legacy, because pain passed down from one generation to another is a curse. But healing passed down, that's a gift. And I had chosen to be a giver. But even as the external world celebrated this new version of me, there were quiet battles I still fought. There were nights when I would hear a song or smell something that reminded me of my childhood, and the ache would return, sharp, uninvited, but familiar. I learned not to run from it. Instead, I let it sit beside me, like an old friend I no longer feared. We'd sit together, me and the ache, and remember, not just the pain, but the strength, the way I kept going, the way I found light even when it seemed like none existed. And in those moments, I often thought of my mother. I missed her in ways words can't touch, but I felt her everywhere. In my home, in the flowers I planted in my backyard, in the softness I kept alive inside me, even after so much harshness. She had taught me to be gentle in a world that hadn't always been kind. She had planted seeds of love that bloomed years after she was gone. Sometimes I would listen to her tapes again, especially the last one. "I hope Amanda never settles," she said. "I hope she knows how rare she is. I hope she learns to love herself before anyone else does." Those words became my compass. So I did things I'd never done before. I traveled. I took a solo trip to Seattle, just to feel rain on my face and walk without anyone knowing my name. I visited a museum in Chicago and cried in front of a painting that reminded me of her. I started volunteering at a local nonprofit that worked with survivors of domestic abuse. I met women who had endured far worse than I had, and still found ways to laugh, to dance, to rebuild. Their courage fed mine. And then, slowly, I opened myself to love, not the desperate kind I used to chase, not the performative kind, but real, gentle, respectful love. His name was Elijah. We met at a book club of all places. He didn't know my story when we first spoke. He didn't ask intrusive questions. He just listened and made me laugh and asked about my dreams instead of my trauma. With him, I learned how to be soft again, how to trust, how to be held without bracing for pain. It wasn't easy. I had walls. He knew that, but he didn't try to knock them down. He waited, patiently, and, brick by brick, I let them fall. One night, after we had been seeing each other for almost a year, he said something that took my breath away. "You know," he said, "I don't know everything you've been through, and I won't pretend to understand all of it, but I do know this. You are the strongest person I've ever met, and you love with a heart that refuses to be hardened. That's rare, Amanda. That's beautiful." I cried, not because I was sad, but because I believed him, and that was the final piece. Belief in myself, in the life I had built, in the possibility of joy. The house I once bought as a refuge had become a home, a place of warmth, of laughter, of healing. I hosted dinners. I celebrated birthdays. I grew herbs in the kitchen and played music while I cooked. My past didn't haunt those walls. It whispered sometimes, sure, but only to remind me of how far I'd come. As for the final loose ends, I let them remain undone. I never visited my father's grave. I never responded to Cheryl's second letter, though I kept it. Some doors don't need to be opened again. Some stories are meant to end quietly, with a full stop instead of a comma. And this one? This story, the one that began with a man who told his daughter she was a mistake, ends with that daughter standing in her truth, surrounded by love, purpose, and peace. It ends with her voice strong, her back straight, her heart open. It ends with her knowing, beyond a shadow of doubt, that she is not only not a mistake, she is the answer to a question the world forgot it asked. It's been 4 years since my father died. 4 years since I sat in that cold lawyer's office holding a letter that should have come decades earlier. A lot can happen in 4 years. You can change cities, change jobs, fall in love. You can wake up one day and realize that the life you're living finally feels like it belongs to you. Not borrowed, not inherited, not a desperate attempt to rewrite someone else's failures. Just yours. 4 years ago, I was still carrying the weight of proving I wasn't a mistake. Now, I don't carry anything I didn't choose to hold. I still live in Orlando, in that same house with the blue shutters and the porch that catches the morning light just right. But everything inside has changed. The furniture, the smell, the energy. My home now feels like sunlight and quiet strength, like healing, like I imagined safety would feel when I was a little girl hiding in my bedroom while my father raged in the other room. There are no ghosts here, no unspoken grief, only memories I've chosen to keep and those I've finally allowed to fade. Elijah is still by my side, not as a crutch, not as a savior, but as a partner. We don't talk about the past much anymore, not because we're pretending it never happened, but because we've learned that sometimes love is louder in silence. In the way he leaves the porch light on for me when I work late, in the way he reads every draft I write, even when I insist it's not ready, in the way he traces the scar on my hand with his thumb and doesn't ask how I got it, because he already knows enough. We're talking about starting a family. It scares me more than I expected. Not because I doubt my ability to love a child, but because I still sometimes fear becoming him, my father. I worry that some hidden darkness will rise up in me one day and spill out where it's not welcome, that I'll speak too harshly, that I'll repeat a cycle I've worked so hard to break. But Elijah always says the same thing, gently, patiently, as many times as I need to hear it. You already broke the cycle, Amanda, just by being aware of it. And I believe him. Most days. I've continued writing. My second book came out last year. It wasn't a memoir. It was fiction. A story about a woman who builds a garden over the ruins of a house that once held her pain. It's not subtle, but it's honest. And it was my way of showing the world, and myself, that I don't live in the past anymore, that I can create beauty without bleeding for it. That book reached more people than I ever imagined. Book clubs, school curriculums, women's circles. I've received letters from strangers in places I've never been, telling me that my words helped them speak truths they had buried for decades. One woman from Iowa wrote, "You didn't just give me a voice. You reminded me I already had one." Sometimes, when I walk through bookstores and see my name on a cover, I still get that old rush of disbelief, not because I don't think I'm worthy, but because there was a time when I truly believed I wouldn't make it out of that house alive, not physically, but spiritually, that I would always be the girl who was too much, too sensitive, too broken to become anything real. But I'm here. I made it. And I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm thriving. A few months ago, I received a package in the mail. No name, no return address, just a single word written on the top. Grace. Inside was a necklace. Simple. A small gold pendant with the letter J. No note, no explanation. I knew exactly who it was from. Cheryl. She's never tried to see me, never pushed for a relationship, but every now and then she leaves these breadcrumbs, gentle reminders that someone else loved my mother too, that my mother's story didn't begin or end with Richard. I wear the necklace on days when I feel lost. It reminds me that even the smallest things, a pendant, a tape, a sentence, can be anchors in a storm. Every year on my mother's birthday, I do the same thing. I wake up early. I make coffee. I light a candle. I play one of her tapes, just one, and then I go to Lake Eola and sit by the water. I don't cry anymore, not the way I used to. Now it's more like gratitude swelling in my chest. I sit there and I talk to her, not out loud, just in my thoughts. I tell her about my week, about Elijah, about the new chapters I'm writing, about the life I've built, and I thank her for the strength, for the softness, for the seed of love she planted in me and nurtured, even when everything around us was falling apart. Sometimes I imagine her sitting next to me, just like she did when I was little, her arm around my shoulder, her eyes on the water. She doesn't say much in those visions. She just smiles. And somehow, that smile feels like approval, like peace, like closure. Not everything needs a perfect ending. Some things just need to be witnessed. A few weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a high school. They were reading my first book as part of a mental health initiative, and the teacher thought it would be powerful if the students heard the story from my voice. I was hesitant. Teenagers can be brutal, but I went. I stood in a room full of 17-year-olds and told them about a little girl who was called a mistake, about how words can become chains if you let them, about how silence can feel like protection but is often just another kind of prison. I told them that healing isn't linear, that you can still be triggered on days when everything looks perfect, that being strong doesn't mean being invincible. And when I finished, one girl raised her hand. Her voice shook when she spoke. My dad says stuff like that to me sometimes, that I ruined his life, that I should never have been born. The room went silent. I walked toward her. I didn't say anything wise. I didn't have a rehearsed answer. I just said, "I know. And it's not true." She nodded. Then she started to cry. And in that moment, I knew I had done what I came here to do, not just in that classroom, but in this life. I had broken the chain. I had turned pain into purpose. And I had left behind a map for anyone who might still be trying to crawl their way out of the dark. Because if I could do it, if the girl once called a mistake could grow up to write her own ending, then maybe someone else could too. Maybe they already are. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the trauma, not the pain, but the transformation. The quiet, brave decision to become something beautiful in spite of it all. So if you're still here, listening to my story, I want you to hear this from me, not as a writer, not as a speaker, but as someone who's been exactly where you are. You are not too broken. You are not too late. You are not a mistake. You are becoming, and that, in itself, is enough. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved just to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your strength. If Amanda's journey resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more powerful stories of healing, resilience, and self-worth. And if you know someone struggling to break free from a painful past, send this their way. Remember, choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Thank you for watching, and never forget, you are not a mistake. You are becoming.